Welcome back to Neurodiverse Christian Couples. I am alone today as your host, Dr. Stephanie Holmes. Usually my husband Dan joins us. But today for our guest, we're going to talk about a personal subject. And Dan's like, I don't know what I add to this conversation. Maybe you and Shawna should have this conversation, the two of you. So my guest today is Shawna Meeks. Welcome to the show, Shawna.
Thank you for having me.
Let me tell you a little bit about Shawna Meek. Shawna is an author, International Coaching Federation professional certified coach, a member of the board of directors, as well as coaching supervisor with the Association of Partners of Sex Addicts Trauma Specialists. Is that APSATS? Is that how you would say it?
That
Okay.
is, yep, you got
And
it.
the founder and owner of Living Stones Coaching LLC, she began her work in the field of specialized coaching after finding strength through her own difficult journey of marriage. She has over 15 years of educational, personal, professional experience and brings unique and balanced perspective to her clients and supervisees. She currently reaches women around the world through her website, podcast appearance group, and individual coaching, supervising other professionals. And now, why she's here on Neurodiverse Christian Couples, she is in a neurodiverse marriage to her husband, Kevin. They have children ranging from elementary school age to married young adults. She has a strong faith in Jesus as her savior and knows that through the darkest times, there is always hope for creating healthier relationships for herself and others. Has quite the story, and that I can't wait for us to dive into. But let's start with your professional story, kind of what you do, because I've kind of advertised this as betrayal trauma. So, talk to the listeners a little bit about the specialty you have and the wives that you work with, and this betrayal trauma in various forms of like porn and sexual addiction.
Yeah, you bet. So the role that I play professionally is I am a betrayal trauma specialized coach. That is most of the work that I do. And also venturing now in the last couple of years into the neurodiverse couples realm, and putting that lens on. But originally, my original training is with APSATS, and really the focus is looking at betrayal trauma. So where have we been impacted from someone violating us at a deep level of trust and well-being? And the intimate betrayal is really what I'm talking about. The word betrayal trauma can be used, in parental, family of origin roles, institutional roles, lots of those sorts of realms as well. But mine is more of the intimate betrayal trauma work that I'm doing. So most of my work is with women, but some with couples as well, stepping into building trust and looking at what has happened, what has deeply fractured the relationship. And a lot of times that is porn addiction, that is infidelity, that can be also problematic sexual behavior, maybe not at the level of addiction, but problematic sexual behavior that has been compulsive in nature.
Right. I mean, because there could be like voyeurism, someone
Yes.
peering into places they shouldn't, or
Yep.
exhibitionism.
Yes.
It can be fetishes. It can be even wanting to use S&M bondage type stuff with their
Yep.
spouse, and their spouse doesn't want to, and kind of forcing them into sexual spaces they don't want to because of their own addiction or objectification of their wife in the act of sex. So it's really broad. So I'd like to kind of talk about um, some of the common ones. So I got this email in, and I'd love for you to react to it. Christian wife really wants to be a godly wife in a Christian marriage, and her husband's on the spectrum. And her husband said to her that because he is the head of the marriage, he has
Mhm.
decided he would like for them to expand their sex life, and he would like for them to watch porn together. He would like for her to emulate some of the things in the videos. And it's not wrong because he said so. He's the head of the house. And as long as they watch the porn together, it's not going to be a problem. And I was kind of shocked to find I've had several wives with this um, same thing, that they ended up watching porn with their husband because sometimes a pastor or Christian counselor said, well, if you're doing it together, it's not wrong. It's not deceitful. It's all out there, on the table. So I'd like to start with that because that's actually the most common thing that I hear is
Mhm.
if you just watch the porn together, it somehow is okay and will spice up your sex life. So how do you how do you speak to that as a betrayal trauma therapist in this arena?
Wow, I could feel it in my body. I could feel a little visceral response there. But I really go back to well, a couple things from a Christian lens. Is that an intimate connection between two people, or have we now invited something else, someone else, through the means of pornography into our intimate relationship? And that, to me, I think is where I hear a lot of you know the threat to the relationship, truly. And when that becomes one person deciding on that, first of all, I don't believe that's what God's called us to do, to bring it in, even if it is coming from a pastor. I believe God wants our mind pure with the one person he's designed in our marital covenant. And that's my personal stance on it and what I believe God's calling us to. But from a professional standpoint, I think, it causes a lot of comparison. There's a lot of hypervigilance that comes with that. If one person's deciding, is it really truly consensual? Or is it someone saying, well, I'm the head of the household, which then becomes more of a dominance thing or a one person decision, and I just need to follow along, which that becomes very problematic for a lot of partners. And I'm not here to say that we need to pick up shame if that's where we've been, because I want to be really tender with that. If we think that's been, well, I thought that's what I was supposed to do because my husband brought that in and we are doing it together. So we are in our bedroom or in our home. But a lot of times it can bring just a threat response to the relationship. And we can't control all of those responses within our body and our brain either. But we can trust when it doesn't feel right, because that, again, there's just not, I don't think it's that level of connection that we really deeply desire in relationship if we're bringing something else in, like pornography, or even if it's not the extreme of pornography, but if it's things that go against our value system. That, I think, is really important to look at and say, I'm not comfortable with that. Where is that line? And I think that's a really important element myself.
Absolutely. In the community that I live in, I was also shocked to find, because more than one person kept telling me when I used to have an office, like, Stephanie, are you aware of the Christian swingers group that's at
Hmm.
so and so's church? And I was like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Christian swingers group that they are kind of associated with so and so. What? Like that is
Hmm.
mind blowing to me.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that, oh yeah, if you're ever at a party and there's a plate out and you put your keys in it, that means that you're open. And I was like, oh dear, note to
Oh, wow.
self: always keep the keys in the purse, you know, close
Keep it close by.
close at
Yes.
hand. And that same kind of thing that I
Yeah.
was starting to hear from a neurodiverse couples, that like, well, he said, or our counselor said, if we're open to doing it together, then somehow that makes it not breaking our covenant. And so, really, this whole concept of, like, back to what Dr. Jake spoke about, is like,
Mhm.
sex and intimacy is between those two people. You can go
That's
to a
right.
licensed Christian sex therapist to kind of spice up your life, to learn what you like,
Yes.
how to have communication around that area. But your point is so good, that when you go into inviting this other thing, or this other
Hmm.
couple, or this other images into
Yes.
your bedroom, into your mind, into your spirit, um, that's not really what God intended in your covenant sex life.
Yeah. It becomes really confusing, I think, a lot of times too, because those images they don't just leave. We know how our brain holds those images. So we think we might be just bringing it into the bedroom or our home, and they go with us. They stay. I mean, they're sadly, the coders that are coding this stuff are coding it to stay in our memory. And so then we have potentially, fantasy and other things, either partner, and can really be it can really be devastating to the relationship. And I hear that a lot later, even if someone has said, just been brave enough to share, I did do that. that never felt right for me. That never, sat well with my spirit. And so really trusting that is really important, but it can be really confusing to our mind too if we start to bring that in.
So another question that came in, I put out a newsletter a while back, got questions, and then I'm going to find
Mhm.
the expert to answer. So a couple of questions came in around specifically wives saying, my husband says because it's porn and not a real affair, it's not really breaking our
Mhm.
covenant. It's not really adultery. Doesn't really seem repentant around it, just as like,
Mhm.
this is kind of what I'm going to do. And then there's some that's talked about, my husband doesn't understand when he repeatedly does this porn and then he's deceptive about it and I keep finding out about it, it's re-traumatizing me. And my
Mhm.
husband doesn't understand why this is traumatizing at all. So can you kind of speak to this, both areas of that in the porn? One is like unrepentant. It just is what it is. It's what men's do. It's every man's battle.
Mhm.
And
Exactly.
it's, well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to try not to. And then there's the repeated and repeated deception and lies
Yeah.
and how that wears down trust. Will you kind of speak to that?
Yeah. Um, my first thought was ask a betrayed partner. Ask someone who has been there and experienced that if it's not causing any harm. Because the truth is, it most often is. And it is causing threat responses that even resemble. The research shows a lot of the PTSD symptoms that we think, wow, PTSD, isn't that for war veterans and other people in traumatic events? This is showing and proving to be that devastating to our well-being and to our intimacy and our connection. And so I take that, though it's not an affair or a real quote real person, does not mean that the deception is not hitting as hard. The deception, the second thing you were saying around that, the deception hits pretty much just as hard. You have withheld this from me. So my sense of you are for me and that I can believe that you are for me is missing there. And as we talk about that has said love and really look at that, do I believe you are really for me? Right? Where do we put the
Seems like you're for
pronunciation on
yourself.
that?
That's what it feels
Exactly.
like.
That's exactly right. Who are you pleasing? Right, in that moment. And I'm not just saying sexuality is just to please, it is for such a deeper connection. But asking a betrayed partner and saying, does it feel that different if he's sneaking around and doing porn just because he didn't do, or didn't have an actual affair? And I have a lot of clients that'll come to me and say, well, it wasn't that bad. And I'm like, well, explain that to me. Tell me how it wasn't that bad. What is that bad? How do we have anything to compare it to when he's, looking at pornography after you go to bed, or when you leave to run an errand, or the symptoms? All of the responses are the same. The way that we receive it is pretty similar to an extramarital affair. So that deception is really what hits, I think, the hardest. So I kind of combined both
Yeah,
scenarios.
because I think it's, from what I hear, is it's the deception. It's then when the spouse finds it and then has the extra burden of coming to her spouse, or his or her, I guess, because women can have pornography issues too. But
Hmm.
when you're
Hmm.
the spouse that finds it and you're the one that has to
Yes,
go and then confront or talk about it, that's another layer of trauma and trigger there too,
absolutely.
to know that information and now to have to confront, that's another space. And then the ladies would say also, like, you brought the other woman or women or people,
Hmm.
whatever you're watching, into our house. You
Yes,
brought that into our house. You brought that spirit, maybe even of lust, into our house. And then, as
yes.
so many devices are linked and people pass down phones to their
Hmm.
children when they get a new phone or a tablet, there's a secondary exposure there, finding
Yes.
old histories and children finding this and be like, what is this? And being exposed to this. So it's like, so I don't know the word. It's like it gets so deep. It's not just about
Hmm.
that one act or the betrayal. There's the deception, there's the spirit of lust, there's what you've opened into your home, there's that extra layer of ooh, ick in my house, and then the kids' possible
Yeah.
exposure through devices. And I can't tell you how many kids I've worked
Yes.
with that found out an affair
Mhm.
that their parents were having, or porn, or something very devious that their parents were into because they got that device and found this information. They weren't looking for it. It
Yeah.
just was there through an old Facebook account or something that had been there. And that's very traumatizing to children as well.
Absolutely. The word I think of is it infiltrates the house, the
That's the
home.
word I
Is
wanted.
it
Thank
is it
you.
again?
That's the word. I was like, it's not
There it
inception, it's
is.
in something.
Yes, yes. And it just starts to seep in. And the question that comes up for me as you're saying that is, would we be okay explaining what we would to our wife, to our children? Would we be okay if their marriage just, quote, brought in some porn, or because it was this? Or is that really justifying and denying that there could be problematic behavior, that there could be something really fracturing the relationship? And so those are the questions that I think are important to ask ourselves in that moment. If it is infiltrating our home and we find that so devastating when it's our children, most of the time, why aren't we finding it so devastating when it's infiltrating our marriages? And we're
Yeah, and it's
saying
like
that's okay.
we and Jesus was clear about this. I have to believe, I know people have different theologies about Jesus, but I believe
Mhm.
Jesus had to know what 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 relationships and what could be in our home in the future, because he
Yes,
says if you look at a woman and lust at with her in your heart, it is the sin of adultery. And so
absolutely.
he speaks to it, that adultery is not just an affair, although that is terrible and painful too. But it is a lustful eye. It is the
Yep,
comparison. It is the having sex with her in your mind.
that's right.
That is part of the same sin, and so it's very confusing. And we're kind of talking about Christian women because, kind of in the context of the show, a lot of men on the spectrum have struggled. It's kind of, I see it
Yeah.
as like a dual addiction:
Hmm.
technology, because most pornography is
Yes.
coming through technology. And so there's already drawing to technology, and then it's impersonal, and then it's just so available. And
Hmm.
there's already special interest and addiction to phones and tablets and all that kind of stuff. And then add in it's porn, or if it's sexual in nature, it's kind of like a 2 for 1
Yeah.
addiction. And it makes it, and then when it becomes a special interest, that becomes really problematic in a neurodiverse couple. So it's like already painful and difficult in a neurotypical couple, but it adds that extra layer, I think, for a neurodiverse couple. So where do you kind of see that extra space in what we're talking about in a neurodiverse situation?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, and I won't go into all the brain science. I'll let you and some of the experts really talk about that. But the parts of the brain that are impacted in sexual addiction are very similar to some of the parts of the brain that are impacted with autism and neurodiversity. Our percentages are showing a lot higher. There's not a lot of research to my knowledge yet around autism or Asperger traits as much as there is ADHD. And so I look at that and I think, that's really interesting that those parts of the brain are kind of getting hit the same. And so I think it's really, really, really imperative that we look at the lens of the neurodiversity. And I'll share a little bit more about my story in a bit, but just from a professional standpoint, I think it's important because there's some parts of deficit in what I'm continuing to learn in neurodiverse relationships, and the person, that may be on the spectrum, that are, they have to work harder at that, or really, try to overcompensate or compensate for some of those deficits. And I think it's important we look at it because they can be really addictive if we're not getting those pauses, or we're not having a theory of mind about how this might feel to my spouse. I'm just thinking, well, for me, this makes sense. So I'm going to keep going down, and I can justify it. Well, if we think about it, it's really hard to put ourselves in that place, I guess, to um to really separate out the neurodiversity from the addiction from my lens. The more I learn, it's really hard to separate it, because and it doesn't mean everybody that has a compulsive behavior or a pornography problem or addiction or whatever that might be is neurodiverse. I'm not saying that, but our audience here, we're talking about that and saying I think it's really important that we are extra cautious,
Right.
is what I would say. I don't think we need to be under cautious, if that's a word or a phrase. I think we need to be extra cautious as to what is the lens and what parts of the brain are being affected.
Right.
So,
Because if we're kind of speaking like to the autistic piece of the neurodiversity, when
mhm.
something gets in there and gets put into a pattern,
Yes,
watch it on Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays, and it's become part of a
yes,
pattern. Or I watch this because I'm stressed, and the release while watching it helps me. Now that's the way I deal with my stress. And then combine maybe the ADHD and going for the dopamine hit. It's an easy dopamine hit.
exactly.
And so this is an easy
Exactly.
way I get that met when there's like three other neurotransmitters. We could be building oxytocin and serotonin and endorphins. But dopamine is the cheapest one. A book I was reading talked
Mm,
about dopamine's the one with no conscience.
wow.
Oxytocin, starts to think about your partner, your spouse, and how that affects you. And endorphin thinks a little bit more like how that affects me. And serotonin is about mood, but dopamine is just all about
Mm,
me. Whatever meets my need for pleasure or happiness or stress relief in the moment. There's no conscious of any kind of effects on that. And so it makes it a little more insidious of a
exactly.
problem because it works. The problem with strategies, even if they're unhealthy strategies, is they work. If the strategy didn't
Yeah.
work for what you were looking for it to do, you wouldn't continue to do it. Nor do you sometimes look for a healthy or better strategy. And then the more we do that in deception or in dark and keep that to ourselves, the less likely to expose that to the light and then get the help that we need. So I think that's just such a big, and then you kind of
Yeah.
brought in that theory of mind thing like, well, if my wife was just okay with it and if she would just be content about it, this wouldn't be a problem versus like, this is really traumatic and betrayal,
Exactly.
that you're not getting how this is really rifting that you would rather do this than be with her if it's a situation where she feels like there's withholding or you just did this yesterday and now you're expecting her to be with you. That's also like there's
Yes.
different levels of betrayers and traumas on both of those.
Yeah. And we think about like just where is that safety in there? Where's the trust that if you are doing this on the side, then where is the safety for me in that place? And we know enough about pornography or anything outside of the marriage sexually, that dopamine, back to that is going to pull us away from our spouse typically. Like it's not typically going to draw us closer.
No, dopamine is
So
self-serving.
it's
It's
all
me.
self-serving. Exactly. So everything, it's literally pulling us rather than bringing us back together. And so when we try to rationalize it, those are the things like, tell me how it's bringing you closer. Like, what is it really doing for both parties to bring you closer, in those intimate spaces? And that tends to be, I think, the thing that we can't attune to people if we keep getting dopamine hits. We can't attune to each other's needs. We can't repair even small ruptures in a relationship if we keep getting those places and we're coping with those places outside of our person. And
Yeah.
so we look at the attachment piece too. And that's our person. That's where we want to draw closer.
Right, because this,
So,
like you mentioned the word Hesed, there's no
mhm,
Hesed love in
mhm.
porn and masturbation and addiction.
Yep.
And then that's that attachment, right? If you're not for me, who are you for? And I can't joy build. And
Right.
Dr. Wilder would say, sex addiction, pornography, he calls it a beep, which is a joy substitute. You may get that
Mm,
dopamine hit, but it is not relationship building.
yes.
It is not attachment building. It is not relationship with God building. It is just self serving, but it
Right.
feels good, so it becomes like a false sense of that. I want to kind of shift us into kind of Christian materials on this a little bit
Mhm.
because so a couple of decades ago, the materials were super shaming. And so
Yeah.
about even masturbation or pornography, which a couple of decades ago, it would have been more print media, go to
Yep.
the 7-Eleven and it was that secret thing behind that you couldn't see
Right.
if you weren't
That's
18.
right.
So it was a little more hidden, but it was like that, ooh, what's that in that magazine? So we had in the Christian material a much more kind of shaming, strong-handed, it's better to pluck out your eye. And I even heard from some counselors like they actually did
Yes.
have people who were pulling their eyes out because
Mm,
the Bible said if you struggle, pull it out. It's like, wow, that's not what it
yeah.
means. But we swung a little bit too far, I think. It's
Mm,
like the Christian materials kind of wanted to be the cool kid on the block. And it's like, okay, we should be
mhm.
talking about this, but it normalized it so much like, well, everybody's doing it. So if everybody's doing it, let's just talking about it. Let's just totally take the shame and totally take that this is not good for you out of it. And let's just examine it in this way. In fact, let's be cool and send nudes to each other as a married couple, and it's like, whoa, how did we go from this really toxic shame, you're a terrible worm, to like, hey, everybody's doing it. Let's just chat about it like it's casual and it's not that big a deal. Let's just, not get addicted to it. What's been your experience with Christian materials around this topic?
Yeah. I think I mine is very similar to what you just shared there in the swing. And I think the sad part, and for me, that reality of young adults, even right now, even younger than that in high school, things that, are just normative now. And I hate to say that, but I think there is some parts of even in the church that I'm not saying it's endorsed by any means, but even young children or young adults making some of these things okay. And I do wonder just how much we're kind of desensitizing our own healthy shame or healthy guilt by saying, well, we don't want to feel that. So we have to normalize something that's infiltrating also our world and getting it's so accessible. It's not, it's in private, it's in isolation. We don't have to go to those places, typically, triple X stores or 7-Elevens. We don't have to go there anymore. But I think some of it, it's diluting, in my opinion. And I think some of the things in what we consume is really important in how we filter that, and how do we filter that through what God is telling us, and truly not ignoring our conscience and our spirit within us to say, wait a second, if that feels off, are we teaching our children, are we teaching our young adults, are we doing that as adults, to say we want to feel a little bit of that healthy
There should
healthy
be
guilt.
healthy shame
There
that
should be
turns
healthy
us to
shame and guilt.
repentance, right?
Exactly.
I think
Absolutely.
part of that comes from if you're my age, I'm in my late 40s,
Mhm.
and older. I grew up in the youth group purity culture. And so while I am for abstinence before marriage, of course, the purity
Yes.
culture was about if you do this, if you masturbate, if you have sex outside of marriage, if you see porn, you have ruined your marriage sex life forever. You'll
Yes.
never get back
Yes.
what God intended. So don't break this rule or it'll be awful. And then if you get married and you're pure and you're a virgin, your sex life is going to be amazing with no how to's on
Mhm.
like how to actually do something to build your sex. Like just the fact that
Absolutely.
you were a virgin, you're like, boom, it's going to show up and be angelic and be perfect. And neither one of those is true. So we kind of took the purity culture and swung way over to the grace
Yes.
culture of, well, if I mess up, I'll just ask Jesus to forgive me. He'll forgive me because he loves me. It's like a
Mhm.
greasy grace thing. And then it's like,
Yes.
well, it's kind of like that. I think it's Chip. Eat all you want, we'll make more. It's just
That's
like
right.
sin all you want.
Mhm.
God's got the forgiveness for
Yeah.
you. So it like went from purity to all the way over here to just grace. Just grace
Yes.
covers a multitude of sin. To where I've even heard pastors and counselors shaming the spouse who's been betrayed. Like, well, you just have to keep forgiving. If they do
Mhm.
porn 70 times seven, you just forgive 70
Yeah.
times seven. If that's just their proclivity, you just have to give them enough grace to cover it. And no one's talking about the trauma and the
Mhm.
effects of the person who's in that. So I
Yeah.
would love to know a little bit about the
Absolutely.
brain science of the trauma stuff to the brain.
Yeah.
What can you share for the listener and the person that who's maybe saying this is not a big deal? They're just two women. They just don't get how men work. What's really
Yeah.
going on in the brain for the one who's betrayed, and what's happening in the person
Yeah.
who's looking at porn? What's changing in their brain?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing, if we think of the subcortex of the brain, the midbrain that is being affected through betrayal, that amygdala, that small almond-shaped amygdala, primarily, I think it's the right side. You might be able to correct me.
I think it is
But
the
it's
right side because
really
that's our
okay.
relational side.
That's the side. Yep. So that is really it's in that fight or flight. It's in a threat response state. And it will be on alert all the time because it can't perceive real threat from perceived threat. And so when that's happening, so someone, well, I didn't look at, something, or I didn't go out and talk to that person or whatever it might be, but the brain is still scanning for safety. The brain is still doing that. And every time that happens, it's storing a memory in our hippocampus, I think, if I'm saying it right. And so recognizing it's storing that and it's trying to figure out, how do I keep myself safe? Is my partner safe for me? And when it's scanning, that prefrontal cortex in the front, forward part of our brain is going offline because it's trying to keep us safe. And so those are the things that betrayed partners really, I mean, these are why I wrote some of the things down of what happens to the brain in that point. The ruminating, the constant ruminating around thoughts, the irritability, even angry outbursts that all of a sudden, why is she so angry? And I'll say she here from the work that I do. um, that hypervigilance, scanning for that safety, social isolation, loss of interest, flashbacks, nightmares. Those are things that the brain is doing to say, are we safe? So when we want to minimize it and say that it's not problematic, why don't we look at how her brain is responding to this? Because we can't argue with what the brain is telling us and what the brain is doing. And so those things, that is something that, then becomes really devastating to the body and the nervous system, right? And I could take it a lot farther. A lot of autoimmune happens because all of that, all of those hormones that it takes, all of that cortisol and adrenaline to keep myself safe in my primary relationship is going to impact my nervous system. It's going to impact my immune system. And going, okay, what are the things that come up? A lot of digestive issues, a lot of thyroid issues we see, a lot of adrenal fatigue, a lot of these things that we don't often see at our maybe Western doctors, but if we go to naturopathic, kind of medicine doctors and things like that to say, what's going on? Why am I tired all the time?
It's the root, not the
What's the
symptom.
root of it? So those are the moments that I'm like, let's look at our brain and body and really say somatically what's happening, especially if we swing over to that grace, because that forgiveness word and expecting a betrayed partner to forgive that. What are they forgiving? What has changed, or what might, is there something that has changed? Is there repentance? Is there a true turning 180 from the behavior? And yet we're maybe asking her to go and forgive.
Right. Be first. You be first and
Be
forgive.
first.
If you
Yep.
forgive, then you are opening up for him to be able to change behavior. When we forgive, it's between us and our Lord. It has nothing to do with trying to
Exactly.
change the behavior of the other person.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think that's important because she needs to go through a grief process. There is grief that comes with this. And that's really, really important. I mean, the first stage we talk about in the APSATS training, that is the model that I follow, is safety and stabilization first. So we need to help the partner feel safe and stable. Well, we can't do that if there's still behavior that is either deceptive, hidden, against our value system, against God's word that we can't align with. And then we move into anger, grief, and mourning, which is we call the second phase of the multidimensional partner trauma model. And then we can move into post-traumatic growth. Then we're seeing things like forgiveness. Then we're seeing things like, okay, she can go out in the world and the world feels safe again. But there's a lot of things that I hear. If I could say, man, lots of different quotes is there anywhere safe for me? Is there anyone that doesn't look at porn, or anyone that doesn't betray us in that way? And that's a really hard way to live. That's a hard place to be. And then to be wondering, is that in my home again?
Right. And it
Is that
doesn't help when there's a title that talks about just every man does it.
that's
It
right.
does it for a woman, and you're like, "What? Like
Yeah,
every man is doing this? Every
exactly.
man has this problem? Every man is looking at
Mhm.
me with lust?" That's not a safe feeling either.
No.
So, if you're a man, a Christian man, and that is
Yes.
not your struggle, how do you feel? I'm asking you this question to say that some other person would say, "Well, every guy is doing this. You can't help but
Mhm.
do that." I mean, I think that's falsely blaming and accusing other people
That's
who are
right.
maybe this is not their battle or their struggle. Everybody has something, but this may
Yes.
not be it.